and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today, I am interviewing David Joyner, whose novel called Kanazawa has just been published this week. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, I'm trying to think of when I first met you, and I think it was about 7 years ago at a Japan Times anniversary event in Kyoto.
That's right.
And at that time, I believe, you gave me this book called Lotus Land.
Oh, okay.
That you had written about Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I took it out the other day because, of course, I still have it. And I looked at what you signed it as. And
I remember.
You said, looking forward to meeting you again next time on your island. So I'm still waiting for you to come visit me on Shiraishi Island 7 years later.
Yeah. I'd love to get there. You know, the pandemic is sort of holding me up right now. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where I went to graduate school. And I've lived here, I guess I've moved here this is the fourth time I think that I've moved here. So it's always kind of a soft landing, and and still have some friends here and that sort of thing. So coming back from Japan at the end of 2019, I thought it would be as easy a move as we could make to come back.
Right.
So, and my wife is here too.
Okay. And you're originally from Cincinnati, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, we're both Ohioans.
That's right.
You also lived in Vietnam, which is when you wrote Lotus Land. Is that correct?
Right. Well, Vietnam's kind of a funny story. I never planned to go there. The first time I went was in 1994 as a volunteer teacher. And just prior to that, I was working in San Francisco at the Asia Foundation for an organization within the Asia Foundation called Partners for International Education and Training. But I had been a Japanese studies major in college. And I spent part of my junior year in 1991 in Sapporo in Hokkaido for about 5 months. And I always thought I was going to go back, very, very soon to Japan to live and work. And that didn't happen until after the big earthquake, the Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami and everything. So it took me decades to get back. I was 41. I realized that I really couldn't wait any longer. And I finally made an attempt to return to Japan. And I did. I returned to Akita and I started working at a university there. I got a job, luckily. I found someone to hire me. I was there for a term. And then I got a job in Fukui at a university there. And Fukui is very close to Kanazawa. And once I was there, I was able to I'd been to Kanazawa before that as a tourist, but being in Fukui, just a 45-minute train ride away, I could come and go. And I realized at that point that, I wanted to be based in Kanazawa at some point. And I was commuting every day between Kanazawa and Fukui, which was about maybe an hour and 40 minutes each way. And it was just too much. And so we ended up coming back to the United States in 2019.
So actually, when I met you, you had just come back to Japan.
Yeah, in 2015, I just returned. That's right.
And then after that, I saw one of your short stories in an anthology by writers in Kyoto. And then the next thing I knew, you had a new book with Stonebridge Press called Kanazawa. And I immediately contacted Peter and said, I'd like a review copy of that. And I read it and loved it. And I kind of feel like I've seen you go through these stages. And our Books on Asia reviewer, Tina de Bellegarde, she compared it to an Ozu movie. Ozu, who's a famous film director who did movies such as Tokyo Story. He's a director, a Japanese director. Yeah, and she described it as a slow burn. I'll leave the web address of our review and the show notes for people. But what did you think about that comment?
Yeah, so obviously I was very flattered by the comparison. It was one of the first reviews that I saw about the book. And, before you start seeing the reviews coming in, you're really anxious about what people are going to think about it. And so that sort of calmed my nerves. But yeah, that was very kind of her. And she was very generous in her review. And I feel that she really got the book, got sort of what I was after. Kanazawa is about a cross-cultural marriage between a 36-year-old American named Emmett and his Japanese wife, Mirai. And Emmett, despite having just quit his job as a university teacher, is eager for them to put their roots down deeper into Kanazawa, where they live. And he thinks that getting a machiya, or a traditional Japanese wooden house, a townhouse that he deeply admires and associates with Japan's cultural past, will benefit their marriage and their life together. Mirai, however, unexpectedly pushes for them to move instead to Tokyo, where her sister has found a job and where Mirai also has been offered work as an ikebana artist, so doing flower arranging. And that opposition between small and big city life, between traditional and contemporary life in Japan is at the heart of their conflict. And at the same time, Emmett's parents-in-law are facing a family secret head-on for the first time. And that secret involves Mirai without her being aware of it. And that secret is also behind Mirai's father's obsession with many of the female statues in Kanazawa, and Mirai's mother's disapproval of the drawings that he makes of them. And it's when the secret is finally dealt with, or is at least revealed to Emmett, that he sees his marriage in a different light, and he and Mirai can finally move forward together.
I think the novel really brings into juxtaposition the foreigner's idea of Japan and the modern Japanese person's idea of Japan. And we tend to wax nostalgic about this old Japan. And I did the same thing when I came to Japan. I was looking for what I considered the real Japan. And I found it, of course, on the small island where I live. But a lot of us are looking to get back to some roots and some tradition. We're natural culture vultures, aren't we, when we come? Yeah. That's why we're here. And especially Japan, because if we just wanted to have a good time, drink beer and play, we would go to, a Southeastern Asia country and do that. But here it requires quite an investment in the culture itself and the language. And these are all things that people like us find attractive. So I really liked how you brought that to light, because there is a stark difference between city and countryside in Japan, which we don't feel so much in our countries. I was talking to someone the other day, she's from England, and she said, in England, people love the countryside. It has no stigma at all. So then you come to Japan and people are like, oh, the countryside, the narrow-mindedness, the tradition. And so I thought that was done really well.
I think that attitude may be changing some, especially with the pandemic, where people are, working from home more often, or they're looking for more space. And that's something that you can easily find in the countryside. And the cost of living is so much cheaper there than it is in the big cities. And the stresses, I think, are lower too. And until they experience that, I think a lot of people just aren't aware of it.
I also really liked about your novel is that you have brought the foreigner, the gaijin experience to light via the third person. And most people, including myself, we write books about our own experience. Yet you put the gaijin experience into a novel with characters that aren't you. They may have some elements. Obviously, we all pull from our own experiences to a certain degree. But to have it about other people, where you can add so much more than your own experience, I think is really a step in the right direction. And I can't think of anyone else who does that except for Barry Lancet. He writes novels that span both Japan and the US and some other countries as well. But I really love this direction, and I hope more people will do the same thing, more writers, because it's a very enjoyable read.
There's another writer who also writes in the third person, and her book may actually be kind of an interesting comparison with Kanazawa. And that's Suzanne Kamata. She wrote a book called The Baseball Widow. And if I remember correctly, that novel uses third person narration. And there are technical reasons why third person might be a better choice than first person and vice versa. And sometimes it may simply boil down to an author's aesthetic preference, which is often the case with me, actually. When I started writing Kanazawa, I was in a living situation where I felt very close to the city and realized that I shared, a handful of similarities with Emmett, the protagonist, and what I planned for him in the novel. Not a lot, but a handful of similarities. And I should emphasize here that I'm not Emmett. But writing in third person does give me more emotional distance from my characters and their circumstances than writing in first person. And it also sort of lessens the temptation for me to impose myself on the book and, on Emmett's character. In other words, third person allows me to sort of keep myself separate from Emmett and what he feels and thinks. And he's a product of my imagination. And yet I also want to give him some agency. So I'm more of a conduit and not an active participant in the story, which is mostly his since he's the protagonist. I'm not opposed to writing in a novel in the first person one day, but for right now, I'm solidly in the third person camp. I'm pretty comfortable there.
I think also in the third person, it allows us to actually make those comparisons like Ozu or like Kawabata, who tends to write in the third person about very subtle topics and just about family life and things. And in Japan, of course, there's this long tradition of the I novel, which is first person, which isn't supposed to be construed as being completely autobiographical.
There's a lot of self-referencing that goes on in that. And with the I novels, they tend to be autobiographical. It's fiction, but it's autobiographical fiction. There's a real mix of it, of the two there. But I don't like to self-reference. And I don't like to really be the center on center stage necessarily. And I think that's one reason why I'm not particularly interested in memoir. I feel that I have a pretty good imagination, but I can't imagine myself writing about my own life for 300 pages or more. And, maybe one day I'll write a fictional memoir, but in the end, it'll be fiction,
Another interesting thing about your book is that you talk about Japanese authors. And one of the main authors you talk about is Izumi Kyōka. And I'm wondering if you could tell readers how that ties in with your book, which really ties into sense of place, Kanazawa.
Okay, sure. So, I came across Kyōka well before I ever considered moving to Kanazawa. And since majoring in Japanese studies in the early 1990s, I've been devouring Japanese fiction and translation. And one reason I wanted to make Kyōka a key part of my novel was because he's from Kanazawa. So first of all, Kanazawa is located in Ishikawa Prefecture, which is on the Japan Sea side of the country. It's not on the Pacific side where Tokyo is. And Ishikawa Prefecture stretches mostly north to south between Fukui and Toyama prefectures, and also borders Gifu Prefecture. And Kanazawa is basically in the middle of Ishikawa along the coast with the Noto Peninsula to the north.
What's the population of Kanazawa?
I want to say that the population is between 400,000 and 500,000.
Okay.
So I came across Izumi Kyōka a number of years before I ever considered moving to Kanazawa. And, I was a Japanese studies major at Earlham College in the early 1990s. And since then, I've been devouring Japanese fiction and translation. And one reason that I wanted to make Kyōka a key part of my novel was because he's from Kanazawa. And there are monuments to him all over the city. He's kind of unavoidable, or at least he was to me. And was in my consciousness from the start. And second, I had in my possession two wonderful collections of Kyōka's short stories. One is called Gothic Tales, and the other one is called In Light of Shadows. And both are translated by Charles Shiro Inoue, who I believe is a professor at Tufts University in Boston. And they're amazing stories that I wish were more widely known and read, which is another reason that I included Kyōka in my book, to try to spark new interest in his writing. And while living in Kanazawa, I started digging around for more information about his life. And Inoue has a third book about Kyōka. It's a critical biography, and it's called The Similitude of Blossoms. And it's a treasure trove of such info. It's a brilliant book. And Cody Polton also wrote a book about Kyōka's plays, because Kyōka was also a prolific playwright. And that book is called Spirits of Another Sort. And that also was full of really interesting details about Kyōka's life. And once I became more familiar with his upbringing in Kanazawa and the literary works that he set there, which really weren't that many, but I found myself encountering him more often in my daily life.
Izumi Kyōka is very well known in Japan.
His boyhood home has been turned into a museum, and it's very well done. They often have events there that people do come from out of town to attend them. And there are statues of Kyōka around the city. There are monuments to him. He has a road named after him. There are statues to some of his fictional characters around town. So I do think that people who come to Kanazawa, those for whom his writing is important, I think will seek him out. It's easy to do. And Kanazawa is a very compact city. So while you're seeing, certain parts of the city, you're likely to see something that the city has put up to commemorate his life and work.
Well, I know that as soon as I finished your novel, the first thing I did is I looked up Izumi Kyōka and read some of his short stories. I think Tina, our reviewer, said the same thing. She said, I love a book that you can read and then just go down through so many rabbit holes, and it leads you to another writer and another, whole world of literature. What your novel does is it highlights Kanazawa as a sense of place, connects it to Japanese literature. And do you think that when foreigners read Kanazawa, that they would like to go to the city then and do some of this exploring on their own?
I certainly hope so. And I can't say that was the main reason why I wrote the book. It wasn't at all. But I realized after I wrote it and I started getting a bit of feedback, it might encourage travelers to go from, their tour from Tokyo to Kyoto. Maybe they'll swing through Kanazawa at the same time and spend a day there and kind of explore it, because it's a very culturally rich place.
And the Shinkansen goes there.
It does now.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. In fact, it started running the day after we moved there. And we weren't aware of that and then the next day, the place just started exploding with tourists. And we're like, why? That's because the Shinkansen just started running. And it really changed the city. I mean, it went from having, it seemed like a very few tourists, at least international tourists, to the place just exploding with tourists.
Well, I have to admit that I wasn't sure if I'd been there or not because of, the name Kanazawa. And then you've got Kagawa, Kanagawa,
exactly.
Kanazawa.
Yeah.
And I was like, have I been there? But I haven't. So now if you don't come to my island to visit me, I'm definitely going to go to Kanazawa to visit you when you get back.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds like a deal. Yeah. Yeah. But, I did read some of the early reviews that were coming in. And some people actually said that, they were living in Japan, got an advanced reader copy, and it made them want to go to Kanazawa, or they said that they were now planning to visit. And that's, again, that's very, very flattering. And I hope that enough people read it and that they decide to visit Kanazawa and Kanazawa, I have such positive feelings about the place that I do hope that people go there and help their economy, especially after the pandemic ends.
Well, I see this kind of thing, which I will call literary tourism. I think this is a great way to help revitalize some of the smaller places in Japan that are less known. Because as we all know, Japan just has so much to offer, even in the tiniest communities, because it's such an old country. The traditions are different everywhere you go.
Right. Yeah,
and that's one thing I learned about the inland sea when I moved to this island is the island next door has a completely different culture. And I think Japan is very typically that way. And I certainly noticed when I was writing for the Japan Times for over 20 years that people would come out to Shiraishi Island because they had read about it. We had that kind of tourism. And I know people go to Iya Valley because they read Alex Kerr's book. And hopefully people will go to Kanazawa now because of David Joyner's book.
I hope so, yeah.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, as we ask all our guests, what your 3 favorite books on Japan are. I'm always curious to hear what other people like.
Yeah, there's so many to choose from. So I would have to say that Yasunari Kawabata's Snow Country and Sound of the Mountain made me want to be a writer. And other books did as well. But those 2 kind of stand out for me. Actually, they made me want to be Kawabata, but, obviously that was not going to happen. But when I was starting out as a writer, I typed out on my computer the entirety of each novel, both to learn if I could, I guess you'd say the rhythms of his prose, or maybe I should say the rhythms of his translator's prose, and also so I'd have both manuscripts to study in whatever way I chose, being able to copy and paste them into a new document and kind of look at them and reorganizing things according to my needs. And every 1 or 2 years, I reread Kawabata's books. Not all of them, obviously, that's too big of a time commitment, but a selection of them. And always I go back to Snow Country and Sound of the Mountain. And I'm also a sucker for biographies about writers. And although it can be a little bit hard to find ones on Japanese writers, they're definitely out there. So it's certainly not impossible. And while I could name several that I really like, I'll limit myself to Donald Keene's multi-volume Dawn to the West, which covers the lives and works of many, many Japanese writers, mostly dead ones, or maybe all dead ones, but still. It's a great book, and it's also just a great resource to have. And then finally, there's a travel memoir that I really love among many Japan-related memoirs that I've read. And that's Alan Booth's The Roads to Sata, which I first read when I was in my early 20s, and which also really helped hook me on Japan. And it's hilarious. It's, or at least it was when I was in my early 20s. It's also very informative, very well written, and it's really transporting. Unfortunately, and rather stridently, he made it clear he wasn't a fan at all of Kanazawa. But that was Kanazawa then in the 70s or 80s, and not now.
That was one of the first books I read when I came to Japan. And I reread it a couple of years ago. And I was like, wow, still like, wow.
Yeah, I gift that to some of my friends who I think or hope will come to Japan as well.
So Izumi Kyōka is the main writer from Kanazawa, but there are others too, aren't there?
Oh yeah, there absolutely are. And if you go to the museums in the city that are dedicated to Kanazawa's writers, you'll see very many indeed. And in fact, I have to admit there were times when I wanted to incorporate the life and work of some of Izumi Kyōka's contemporaries from Kanazawa, namely Tokuda Shusei and Muro Saisei, who are the other 2 sort of giants of literature associated with the city. And also the poet Fukuda Chiyoni, who came from an earlier era, the 1700s. But I had to avoid that temptation several times because I couldn't quite justify it.
So, David, what are you working on next?
I just finished another novel set in Ishikawa Prefecture, and it's actually set mostly in Yamanaka Onsen, where my wife and I bought and renovated in Akiya several years ago. And it's partially set in Kanazawa as well. So, it's out on submission right now. I hope that it can find a good home. And then that would be Ishikawa novel number 2.
Well, David, it's been a pleasure talking to you about Kanazawa, and it just came out last week, right?
It did, yeah. I'm still waiting for my copies to arrive. Hopefully soon.
Okay, so everyone grab a copy of that, and the next time you come to Japan, put Kanazawa on your bucket list of places to go while you're here.
Yes, please do.
And it's out in ebook form as well?
It is, yes.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.